We eat because it's pleasurable. That's simply a fact, right? It's the reason we all eat dessert, for example. You don't ever eat dessert because you're physically hungry, because you just ate a full meal. You only eat dessert because you feel like it, because it looks good, or it makes you feel good. And this is the whole point. It makes you feel good. That's the reality. So why deny that?
Welcome back to another episode of the Fasting Method podcast. This is Coach Terri Lance, and I am here with Dr. Jason Fung today. Jason, how are you doing?
Good, good. How are you, Terry?
I'm good. A good month already. So, in our last few episodes, we've been talking about your new book, The Hunger Code. I'm super excited about it because I think it's that missing piece or that next piece that so many people need in this journey. And we've been talking a lot about kind of the failed dieting approaches of the past with calories in, calories out. And you really focus on understanding why we're consuming the food that we're consuming beyond what is needed. So looking at hunger. And we talked about first the homeostatic hunger. And today we're going to move a little more into the other two types that you write about in your book, the hedonic hunger and the conditioned hunger. So let's start with the hedonic hunger and just kind of explain a little bit more of what that one is and how it kind of presents for people.
Sure. So, in terms of the framework, the idea is that if you're overeating, then you really have to try and understand the problem, which is why are you overeating, right? Not just simply that you're overeating, which has been the focus. So everybody's like, you're overeating, eat less. That's not helpful until you understand why. Just like for an alcoholic, if you say you're drinking too much alcohol, you can't just say drink less alcohol. You have to understand why they're drinking too much alcohol. So the homeostatic hunger is what we think of as the physical hunger, and that's really driven by hormones, right? It's not a personal choice. But there's many other reasons that we eat, and two of the most important ones that are almost never discussed, they are sort of peripherally, is hedonic hunger and conditioned hunger. So hedonic is a word that means related to pleasure. So in other words, we eat because it's pleasurable. Okay, and that's simply a fact, right? It's the reason we all eat dessert, for example. You don't ever eat dessert because you're physically hungry, because you just ate a full meal. You only eat dessert because you feel like it, because it looks good, or it makes you feel good. And this is the whole point. When you eat good food, it makes you feel good. That's the reality. So why deny that, right? And it can tip over into a problem where you're eating not because you have this physical hunger, but because you have this emotional hunger, right? And that's the sort of idea of comfort foods. You're eating foods that make you feel better, not physically, but emotionally. You break up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, you eat a type of ice cream. That doesn't satisfy any physical hunger, but it gives you a little shot of dopamine, a little bit of pleasure because you don't have any, or you don't have enough, or you're feeling really down, right? But that can easily tip into two major problems, which is one, ultra processed foods, and two, food addictions, both of which the research behind those two topics have exploded in the last 5 to 10 years. And it's actually probably the most important topic we talk about, which is ultra processed foods. Why are ultra processed foods so bad? And I say it's important because it's really the focus of the new dietary guidelines, which really just came out like 2 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago or something like that, right? And the number one message was not eat less or eat fewer carbs or eat less fat or eat more protein. None of those. The most important message was eat real food. And we saw it in the Super Bowl ads where they're promoting these sort of eat real foods. That's the single most important thing you must do. And it actually also is the sort of golden rule number one in the hunger code, which is eat real food. And the whole thing is that ultra processed foods are different than regular foods because they are engineered to give you maximum pleasure in ways that are not natural. So what happens is that the release of dopamine and pleasure and stuff relies on very quick absorption. So if you think about drugs, for example, nicotine, you smoke cigarettes because the smoke goes from your lungs directly into the blood vessels. You don't eat nicotine because it's too slow. By the time you eat it, you digest it, it gets absorbed. So therefore, nicotine gum is much less addictive than smoking nicotine, which is why they use it, right? Same thing with heroin. People inject it directly into their veins. They don't eat it because it's a much slower process. The addictive potential is much, much lower. The pleasure you derive is much, much lower. And it's the same with foods. So when you eat a natural food, even carbohydrates like beans, the absorption is very slow compared to, say, white bread, which is ground up very fine. The flour is ground up to take away all the protein, they take away all the fat. It's pure carbohydrate. It's ground into a very fine dust. So when you eat it, it gets absorbed and digested very, very quickly, which gives you this massive spike in dopamine, massive spike in pleasure, and insulin, of course, goes way up. When you eat those foods that are super easy to eat, so remember, ultra processed foods also use all kinds of things to make it very, very easy to eat. They're very soft. They're easy to digest. It doesn't require a lot of chewing. It basically dissolves in your mouth. It has like texturizers and emulsifiers and all this stuff to make the meal feel good. Basically, you can inhale it very easily because it's engineered, it's sort of pre-digested so that you don't actually have to chew very much and you don't have to digest it very much. It's basically adult baby food. It goes right down, goes directly into your bloodstream, gives you this hit of pleasure. At the same time, you got artificial flavors, you have all this MSG and maltodextrin and sweetness and stuff. It's engineered for bliss points, right? Salt and sugar and fat and artificial flavors, artificial sweeteners, artificial fats, everything artificial to maximize the pleasure. And everything is taken away that could cause satiety. So anything that makes you full, they take it away. Why? Because then you will eat more. So if you think about ultra processed foods, that's the playbook. Because these foods are manufactured and not grown, they're trademarked, whether it's Cheetos or Doritos or Goldfish or whatever. They're trademarked, so therefore only one company can make them, which makes them ultra profitable for them. They want to make money out of this. They want to make a return on this, of course. In order to do that, they have to get you to eat more. And the only way to get you to eat more is to maximize the pleasure and minimize the satiety. Because if you fill up after the first two Cheetos, you're not eating very much, right? But that doesn't happen. It dissolves in your mouth, basically, and you just keep going and going and going until you eat the whole bag. It's really dangerous because your body just can't handle it because it has never been identified as a problem. Just like when smoking was not identified as a problem, smoking went everywhere. Why? Because nobody thought it was a bad thing. Same with ultra processed foods. Everybody's like, it's so good for you. Look, it's low in sugar, low in fat. It's got artificial sweeteners. It's got artificial fats. It's got artificial flavors. It's got artificial colors. But people are like, look, it's low in calories. It must be good for you. It's like these people are so stupid because it's like, come on, there's all this other stuff going on. And the only thing you think is important is the number of calories. That is ridiculous because what goes on in human physiology is much, much more complex. So the ultra processed foods leads you to hedonic hunger. It's uniquely positioned to create this hedonic hunger. When it gets too far, it tips over into food addiction. So addiction is a food that you can't stop eating, even though you know it's bad for you. And not everybody gets addicted. So not everybody who smokes gets addicted. Not everybody who drinks alcohol gets addicted. And it's not to say that eating a little bit is necessarily bad for you, but some people wind up in a situation where they can't stop. And that's an addiction. And the reason that's important is because it must be treated like an addiction. So you have all these well-meaning but stupid people who are saying everything in moderation. Okay, so would you tell an alcoholic, have a little drink, everything in moderation? Or would you tell a heroin addict, just have one hit? You haven't had one in a while. It's stupid because if they're addicted to alcohol, that one drink tips them off into a big bender, right? And it's the same with food addictions. Now we can measure it with something called the Yale Food Addiction Score. And what's clear is that there is a huge number of people, probably 20-30% of people who struggle with their weight, are actually addicted to these foods. And then people say, again, stupid stuff like, well, you can't stop eating food. I'm like, I'm not telling you to stop eating food. I'm telling you to stop eating the ultra processed foods that you are addicted to. So if you're addicted to alcohol, it doesn't mean don't drink green tea. Why would you say something like that? If you are addicted to ultra refined carbohydrates, it doesn't mean you can't eat eggs. It makes no sense. Those things make no sense. And then there's another one where people say, well, you can't be addictive because it's natural or it's derived from natural things. It's like, yes, but it's processed. And again, well-meaning, but not very smart people say, well, it came from natural sources. It can't be addictive. Well, tobacco, nicotine comes from the tobacco plant. Marijuana comes from the marijuana plant. Narcotics come from poppies. They're all come from natural sources. It's the processing where you take that addictive substance and purify it and take away everything else and then deliver it in a way that is addictive, smoking, for example, as opposed to chewing tobacco leaves. You increase the concentration, you make it easier, absorption is faster. There's many, many ways you make it addictive. And it's the same. Look at what people say they're addicted to. Well, I'm addicted to carbs. I'm addicted to bread. I'm addicted to pizza. I'm addicted to chocolate. I'm addicted to sweets. Does anybody say, I'm addicted to beef? I don't think I've ever heard that. I like beef just fine, but I'm not addicted to it. Am I addicted to scallops? No. Am I addicted to eggplant? No. I like all those foods fine, but when I'm full, I don't just keep eating beef or shrimp or eggs, right? You stop. And that's the point. It's the ultra processing of foods that leads to the food addictions. And when you actually study it, turns out it's actually a massive problem. So the advice to simply eat less is not useful advice because you never acknowledge that these are food addictions. So treat it like an addiction because it is an addiction. And honestly, if you ever watch these shows, the ones that are like following people who are 1,000 pounds, right? It's clear that they have addictions. Like, obviously, they have addictions. They can't even move, right? So clearly, they are suffering. They know they're suffering. You watch them, their knees hurt and they can't move and they're humiliated every day of their life, but they can't stop eating it. But they're not eating salads. I don't see them eating fish and eggs and vegetables. Like, do you see them eating huge, massive salads or a whole cauliflower at a time? Absolutely not. It's always ultra processed food, some kind of ultra processed food. And yes, maybe it has protein and other things in it, right? Because you can ultra process all these things. But it's always, always some kind of junk food. Pizza, big, huge pizzas and stuff. And that's the problem. This idea is that there's more than just the physical hunger. If you really want to understand hedonic hunger, you need to start talking about ultra processed foods. You need to start talking about food addictions and recognizing their importance. Because again, people didn't stop smoking until it was identified as a problem. People didn't stop drinking and driving. I mean, I don't know if you remember, Terry, but in the 80s, there was a lot of drinking and driving, like a lot, and people were getting killed until it really got identified. Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I remember it was MADD, MAD, had bought all these ads and stuff. And then people started to recognize, hey, it's actually tragic. It's actually completely irresponsible to drink and drive because you could kill somebody. You could kill somebody's son. You could kill somebody's mother. It was terrible, right? But before that, people just thought, I'm so drunk, I'm going to go home now. And then the whole designated drivers and all that sort of stuff came around. And it became socially acceptable. Same with smoking, of course, in the 60s, it became identified. Until you identify these problems, you cannot even begin to solve them. And that's why this focus on eat real food that's come out in the new dietary guidelines is so incredibly important because it addresses the underlying hedonic hunger. And that is, I think, a huge step forward. So it goes well beyond the calories and carbs and all this stuff because the complexity of the disease is much more than a single factor. And therefore, you have to understand what is driving hedonic hunger and how you're going to deal with it, identify it, then identify treatment strategies. So that's what the hunger code goes into in the hedonic hunger part, which is actually, I think, hopefully, I'm hopeful that we've actually already started this with this new dietary guidelines. And that's why even in the title of the book, it was resetting your body's fat thermostat, which is again referring to the homeostatic hunger, how hormones can push your thermostat up, push your thermostat down. So you have to focus on the hormones, but also the ultra processed foods, which is so important in today's problem.
I definitely think it's also, as you're describing it, Jason, it's really about identifying at a really basic level. It's not about needing food. That's the homeostatic hunger. Hedonic hunger is about wanting food. It's about what the brain wants and why. Why are we going for those foods? Like you said, even with alcohol, it's not just, oh, let's have this person drink less. It's let's get underneath that and understand, why is this person driven to drink and drink more and drink to excess? Food. No one ever says, I need brownies, realistically, but they certainly want brownies. And that is hedonic hunger. That is wanting reward, wanting satisfaction. And part of the problem that you identified is those foods are not satisfying. They keep us chasing dopamine. They taste good, but they're not scratching the itch for us. And so we keep going because there's no satiety. You will stop eating steak at some point. You will reach a level of satiety and stop. But this dopamine, this reward path, doesn't get satisfied.
And I think that's why drugs like Ozempic actually are quite effective because what happens is that you've got this underlying hedonic hunger, but you sort of massively overcorrect it. Because remember that Ozempic stimulates the GLP-1 system, glucagon-like peptide. So remember, glucagon is a hormone, it creates satiety, but it doesn't give you normal levels of GLP-1. It's pharmacological doses, right? So it's a massive overstimulation of the hunger satiety system to create massive satiety. Of course, it spills over into side effects like nausea, vomiting, and so on, right? But what happens is that that massive overcompensation can actually quash some of this hedonic hunger because you actually just can't anymore take it, right? So that's why people talk about different aspects of GLP-1s, but one of them is that you see less people eating these ultra processed foods because you simply overwhelm it from the other side. And that's certainly one strategy. But again, there are other strategies, such as identifying what the problem is. And if you think about alcoholism, which is a useful concept, it's understood. So if you look at like the 12 steps and all this sort of stuff, right, of Alcoholics Anonymous, what you realize is that the first step is not drink less alcohol. It's actually not even mentioned because it's too stupid. What it deals with is gratitude and forgiveness and friendships, forgiveness, right? You're forgiving your, past ills and moving forward with your life. It talks about spirituality. All of these things that are so important are actually exactly the same things in food addiction, except that in this case, every doctor and dietitian on the planet practically will just tell you just eat less. Whereas nobody who treats alcoholism says just drink less alcohol. When you put them side by side, you realize what a futile gesture that is. Just eat less. Here, I'll help you eat less by putting calorie counts. Like, oh, you should drink less alcohol. Let me put the proof alcohol on it. That'll help you. No, it won't. It's like it won't help at all because you haven't dealt with forgiveness, with gratitude, with spirituality, with friendships, with all of those other things that help people with alcoholism. You haven't helped in the situation of food addiction, which is not merely like a small percentage of people who struggle with their weight. It's a big one, probably 30 to 50%, depending on who you actually talk to. And it's always ultra processed foods. So therefore, cutting ultra processed foods is probably the most important thing to do.
Absolutely. So, Jason, the other type of hunger that we are talking about today that you cover in the Hunger Code book is conditioned hunger. Similar to hedonic hunger, I think this is one that drives a lot of problems with food and is not about need for food. It's not that the body needs to eat, it's that it's choosing or pushing you to eat under certain situations or conditions. So, can you talk a little bit more about conditioned hunger?
Yeah, so where the physical hunger, homeostatic hunger, the emotional hunger is hedonic hunger, and the social environmental hunger is called conditioned hunger. You have to realize that where you live plays a huge role in your risk of overweight, as well as your friends. And you might say, well, why is that so? Well, one, you have to recognize that if you look at other countries in the world, they have far less obesity. And it's not because Americans have less willpower. They have actually the same as anybody else. People are very much the same the world round, right? But if you look at Italy, for example, they have much less obesity. Japan has much less obesity. And these are first world developed Western style democracies, right? So no different. Or Canada versus the US. When you cross that border, the risk of obesity goes way up. Why? The people are very, very similar. The cultures are very, very similar. But it's the environment you find yourself in. Why? Because the environment defines how you eat, what you eat, how much you eat, and so on. It defines the social norms. So if you have a Japanese person in Japan, the risk of obesity is extremely low. You move that person to San Francisco, for example, the risk of obesity skyrockets. It's well known. And they've studied this. If you have a friend who's overweight, your own risk of obesity goes up by like 171%. You can study military families. When you move a military family and put them into a place that has high obesity rates, their risk of obesity goes up. Why? Because you do what other people do. That's human nature. If all your friends are going out for a hike, you're going out for a hike. If all your friends are eating pizza and wings and watching the game, you're eating pizza and wings and watching the game, right? That's just the way it is. It's true for everybody and everything. That's just the way the world works. So, what it means is that you really need to pay attention to the environment you're in. There's two ways it sort of translates to personal conditioning and social influence. So, social influence is this idea that what other people do strongly influences what you do. What is acceptable is normal. So, if you say that it's acceptable to eat a certain portion of food in the United States, then that's what you'll eat. If you go to Japan or Europe, you'll find that the portions are much, much smaller. So you eat much, much less and you eat slower and so on. Satiety winds up being the same because of the way you are. Once you stop eating, you give it enough time, you're sort of full, right? So satiety is about the same. People feel as full, but they've eaten so much less. So it's really about the environment you're in. I'm in Toronto. I used to go travel sometimes when the kids were young to like Orlando. I remember ordering in a restaurant, and these portions were like at least double the size of what I was used to, right? So me and my wife, we'd split one portion because it was huge. It was way more food than we could eat. But if I had lived there for 6 months, I would have started to eat more. That's the influence, that's social influence. And that's why becoming an influencer is so popular. That's why it's such an important thing because it influences us. The other way it translates into personal behavior is something called conditioning. So, conditioning is where you associate two things and then react to them. So, the classic experiment is Pavlov's dogs. Dogs will salivate when you give them food. So that's a natural response. That's always going to happen to everybody. If you ring a bell before you give them food and you do that consistently, what happens is that when you ring a bell, the dogs will start salivating because they expect food to be associated with it. But what you've done is you've paired this neutral stimulus, so a bell, which is neutral in terms of food. It doesn't mean food is there or not. But by pairing them, you've turned this neutral stimulus and produced a conditioned response, which is that when you hear the bell, the dogs start salivating and start to get hungry. So when you pair two things, you will condition somebody to respond. Now you think about what's happening in the United States. You eat the minute you get up. And if you don't, people scream at you, right? You eat when you go get a coffee in the morning. Then you eat at lunchtime. Then you eat in the mid-afternoon at the meeting, right? Then you eat because it's after school snack. You eat at dinner. You eat an after dinner dessert. You eat before bed snack, right? You've paired every single thing with food. You eat in the car, you eat in front of the TV, you eat at the movie theater, you eat when you get to the mall. There's food billboards all around. There's food advertising on TV. There's Food Network where they're showing food all the time. You eat when you go for a drive, you eat in front of the computer. A lot of these things get paired. So what you're doing is you're creating conditioned responses. So every time you go in the car, you want to eat because you've created this conditioned hunger. You go to see a movie. Hey, conditioned hunger. You go see the sports, conditioned hunger, right? You've paired them and you've created hunger. Whereas, for example, you go to some place like Japan, eating on the street is a no-no. You can't eat and walk down the street. People will look at you funny and pretty soon you're going to stop. You don't eat in front of your desk at the computer while you're working. That's a no-no. So you don't do it, right? If you have to work through lunch, you don't eat. You work through lunch. But what you've done is you've created this condition where you're not conditioning yourself to expect food every time you go. You get in the car. Hey, there's a cup holder, there's chips, there's this, there's that, right? Ultra processed foods is convenient and makes it even easier. Fast food, takeout food, right? The whole thing is created for you to eat. The advertising is a huge part of it because they're advertising it to you all the time. And again, ultra processed foods are advertised because they're profitable. Nobody advertises for broccoli because nobody owns the trademark broccoli. But you do own the trademark to Oreos. So Oreos are this and that and this and that, right? You got advertisements with cartoon characters. It starts when people are kids, right? So the candies are associated with fun, right? So you got Toy Story, or you've got E.T., or you've got Shrek, whatever it is, right? Now you've created this conditioned hunger where the character and fun are now associated with food. So now every time you think about it, you think about food, you think about Christmas, you think about Coca-Cola. It's like a very successful advertising campaign built over decades and starting when people were small. And what does it do? It creates conditioned hunger. So if you're overeating, it's because you're hungry, but the hunger could simply be a conditioned response. And again, the key to treating it is to understand it. So if you know that this is the problem, that, hey, I recognize now that every time I go watch TV, I get hungry and I'm eating, not because I'm actually hungry. You are hungry, but the hunger is a conditioned hunger. It's not a physical hunger. It's not a homeostatic hunger. It's not a hedonic hunger. It's conditioned hunger. So therefore, I can now use the entire field of behavioral psychology to help me. Instead of somebody, again, well-intentioned, but not helpful, saying, hey, just eat less. It's like, you can choose to eat less, but you can't choose to be less hungry. You need to understand, why are you getting hungry? And if the hunger is because you've conditioned it, then use the field, use counter conditioning or extinction. Again, two well-studied treatments in the field of behavioral psychology to extinguish unwanted behavior. But you have to understand what it is you're dealing with before you can actually deal with it. We talk about mindsets all the time. Why is it important? Because of the conditioning. That's how you start with behavior change, right? It all starts with your mindset. I think you talk about mindsets more than anybody else I know. That's why everybody
For sure.
is so successful when they work with you, Terri. It's because you have to understand that we're treating eating behavior. And if you think it's about just the diet, you've probably already lost. It's about eating behavior with all its complexities, which talks about habits, which talks about mindsets. You really have to answer the sort of who, what, when, where, why, right? Who are you eating with? Why are you eating? What are you eating? How much are you eating? How are you eating? Are you eating fast? Are you eating slow? All of those things are important. So if you're eating, make sure you eat at a table. Make sure you eat with friends. Make sure you eat with people who support you in what you're doing, right? Those are actually critically important things. And the advice to just eat less does not address a single one of them, other than how much are you eating, but only in relation to calories. not in relation to homeostatic hunger, hedonic hunger, all of those other things. And that's why it's so unsuccessful because it really doesn't present you with a full plan of what you're supposed to do. And that's why I think conditioned hunger is actually probably the most important type of hunger that we never talk about. I mean, I've read all kinds of stuff on weight loss. If you read the scientific stuff, it's 98% calories, which is ridiculous. Why do you insist on talking about calories and blaming people? If 70% of Americans are overweight, then clearly it's not an individual problem. It's a systemic problem. So you have to say, what is it about the food environment that makes us like this? And maybe it means putting limits on advertising. Look what it did in smoking. Smoking, same thing. In the 60s, it was sort of everywhere. And then there's a lot of people that said, well, it's really bad for you, which it is. But there's a lot of people that tried to minimize it. But one of the things that they did was they took away smoking advertising. And that was probably the most important thing. Like, you can't just tell people smoking's bad for you, smoking's bad for you. Nobody cares. Like, you can put pictures of diseased lungs on cigarette boxes. Nobody cares. But the minute you take away that advertising, you take away the sort of coolness factor. I don't know if you remember, like there used to be all these smoking icons, right? The Marlboro Man,
Marlboro Man.
Camel, a lot of the sports were smoking advertised. But you took it away and then you actually deconditioned people so that you no longer responded to it the same. You see what happens, of course. Smoking just continues to go down. Because kids are like, why am I smoking? It's not cool. It costs money and it's filthy, right? It always was filthy, cost money, but it was cool. And that's what advertising does. So when you identify the problem, then you can identify systemic fixes, just like they're talking about no social media for kids. Once you identify that social media is actually super harmful to kids, then you can talk about banning it for kids under 16, for example, which they did in Australia, and other states are actually talking about it. But you have to identify and talk about the problem before you can treat it. And this is why I think conditioned hunger, hedonic hunger are so important because they're basically not in the conversation at this point. But they have to be if you want to succeed. As a country, you have to understand it. And personally, you have to understand it if you want to understand what you are, because they require different solutions. So if you have food addiction, then that's one problem, but conditioned hunger is a completely different problem. You can't use the same solution to two different underlying problems. It won't work as well as you think it will. And that's why the just eat less advice is so horrible, because it assumes that everything comes down to eating less and willpower. It wasn't willpower. Nobody decides to be addicted. Nobody decides to be hungry. You don't know about this conditioning. It's an automatic thing. Just like Pavlov's dogs, it's an automatic response. It's not a willed response. You don't will your body to be hungry.
And I think, Jason, again, one of the reasons why I think this book is so important is because most people that I work with as clients or in the TFM community or that I know of who listen to us and like the information that we share, they have felt like they are broken. Something is wrong with them because from an early age, people even said, you shouldn't be eating that. Don't eat so much. People who had parents who restricted their food or had it taken away or whatever, they've been taught from a young age, it's something wrong with you. And no one was able to say, hey, you're just conditioned to do that. Let's do some counter conditioning here. So now, later in life, people are getting a different playbook that says, you are not weak, you are not broken. This food culture that we live in, at least in the United States, is very not helpful to you. It's helpful if you want to create food addiction, if you want to create habits that will not serve you well. But they never learned that there are other reasons why they're hungry. It's not just don't eat so much. It's let's look at why you're hungry and let's work on that. So again, I think a lot of people, when they get their hands on this book this month, are going to be very excited about a message that you shared a long time ago in the obesity code that it's not your fault.
Yeah. And I think that it is obvious that it can't be just a personal failing. If you have 100 children and 70 fail, it's clearly not an individual problem. It's either they didn't teach the material, the teacher was no good, maybe the school environment was not conducive to learning. Obviously, you have to look systemically and figure it out. If you can't change the environment, you can still change your microenvironment, the people you interact with, your mindsets, right? So, mindsets, I think, is actually crucial because you see it changing. So, sugar, for example, you see that the messaging around sugar has changed. Sugar used to be this great thing, right? So, they used to advertise it. It's funny because, remember Sugar Pops cereal? It's like they were quite proud of the fact that they were like 60% sugar, right? It's like, but this was in the 80s when I was growing up, and it's like everybody, oh, sugar pops, sugar this, sugar that, because it was good. Now, of course, you see the messaging because of, a lot of research that says, hey, look, excessive sugar and added sugars are pretty bad for you, right? So now you see everybody trying to hide all the sugar. Nobody has sugar like sugary cereals and stuff. They have other names, all natural this, all natural that, right? Whole grain and so on, which hides all the sugar. But nobody is so proud of it anymore. And that's the mindset, right? The mindset has changed. So therefore, if you reduce sugars, people are not looking at it as deprivation anymore. They're just looking at it as healthy. Whereas before you looked at sugar and said, well, if it's low in sugar, it's because I want the sugar, but I can't have it. Now it's like, well, I don't really want the sugar anymore. The whole thing starts with this changing of the mindset. And so you can still change your mindset. And that's where I think this messaging these days with the eat real food is actually so important. I mean, we've always talked about it. If you look at the original keto movement, it was actually real food until it sort of got hijacked a little with keto bars and keto this and keto that. The original people who talked about it a lot were all like high fat, but real foods, always real foods. That got lost in the high fat message because that's a lot easier to hijack into a brand, right? But the whole messaging now is to say, hey, if it's ultra processed, it's probably really bad for you. And it's a changing mindset. So instead of wanting that tang orange juice, which is artificial orange juice, you look at it and say, I don't want that. It's so fake. You look at some of these bars out there, it's like, it's so fake. There's just tons of fake stuff in here. It's all ultra processed proteins, so they can say it's high protein, but it's not like beef. It's not like cod. It's garbage protein that you dug out of, the garbage can and processed it and threw it into a bar. I talk about creatine, how people are like, creatine is so good for you. I have images of beef and, stuff like that. You can synthesize creatine from chemicals. It never looks even like protein. You can synthesize it in a lab and make creatine. It's not good for you. Eat the real stuff, right? And that's where I think a lot of this messaging now from the government is very good because it's going to change their mindset. Just like we used to think low fat was good for you. Low fat this, low fat that. Fat is bad. Cut the skin off the chicken and eat really dry chicken breast because there's no fat in it, right? That was all 80s, 90s. It's all changed, but that's because it changed with the change in mindset. That's where you start.
I definitely hear so many people at TFM recognize the more they're eating whole food, the more those highly processed things don't taste the way they once thought they did. They don't enjoy them in the same way. And so I think this is a great example of by changing habits, changing mindset, you shift everything.
Yeah.
And I think definitely with hedonic hunger and conditioned hunger. So we're going to continue talking about this in future episodes, Jason. And along the way, we'll start talking about some more of the ideas about how people can make some of these shifts.
And I just want to mention just that we're going to do a master class to go over all of these concepts and trying to apply them because, again, it's a different toolkit, right? Changing hedonic hunger, changing mindsets, changing habits, all of that is a completely different toolkit than eat less. Here's how to eat less. Count your calories. Here's a calorie counter. That stuff is completely different. It's all sort of new information that stems really from research, new research in the last 5 or 10 years into ultra processed foods, but really exciting stuff coming up.
Yes, I'm looking forward to the masterclass. You'll be involved, other TFM coaches will be involved, so lots of good support for people, helping them integrate this new information. So until next month, Jason, I look forward to seeing you then. The book will be released by then, so there will be a lot of excited people. Take good care, and we'll talk with you soon.
Thanks so much, Sarah.